Hey everyone, I'm the Artful Spuddler and welcome back to my world of contemporary batik painting. I've spent the last 3 weeks experimenting in my studio. There's been random projects on every surface, dye and salt everywhere, and I spent a great deal of time just waiting. So in today's video I'm going to show you what I discovered about dyeing with salt, and I can show you the results of my tests and the effects that I was able to achieve to create textures on cotton fabric using Procyon, MX dyes and salt. If you're a fibre artist, you may have come across this technique before, as it works really well on silk. However, to achieve a similar effect on cotton can be a little more challenging, to say the very least. The reason for this is down to the way that the dyes bond with the fibres. With silk this is delayed and the colours only become fixed to the silk with heat, usually in the form of steam. However, with fibre reactive dyes, that reaction begins the minute that the dye meets the fibres, so obtaining the sort of results that you can get with silk is difficult, if not impossible. But salt dyeing on cotton fabrics can create its own unique textures, and these can be used in batik painting as well as fabrics for quilting and other fibre arts. This isn't a technique that I've explored, to be honest, as I probably haven't tried it out since my days at art college, but I thought that I'd spend a little time exploring the possibilities and letting you all know what I discovered. As with all things batik, there's a fine line between success and failure, and I find that understanding what is going on from a science perspective really helps me to find ways of using the technique successfully. By adding salt, whether it be table salt, sea salt, rock salt, or even Epsom salts, what happens is that the salt absorbs the water on the cloth. It sucks it up and away from the fabric, and depending on the size of the salt crystals and what type of salt you're using, the effects will be different. So to begin my exploration of this dyeing technique, I began by taking a piece of lawn cotton and cutting it to size. Now I have read that in order to achieve a successful salt effect, the cloth needs to be stretched quite tightly over the frame, so I did add a little more tension to my fabric than I would usually do. In my first experiment, I began by pre-soaking my fabric in soda ash, as this was mentioned in many of the instructions that I found online. To do this, I just mixed up some chemical water, soaked my fabric in this solution, moving it around to ensure that the whole thing was fully covered, and I left it to sit for around 20 minutes, and then I removed it and simply let the fabric dry. Once the fabric was pinned firmly to the frame, I sprayed it with plain tap water to dampen the whole cloth slightly, but without making it too wet. I then mixed up 2 blues, 1 warm and 1 cold, and added these randomly to my cloth. As I added the colours, I increased the water on the cloth in parts and tried to create various types of blends, with some areas of the cloth being quite dark and others where I have added a little more diluted colour, a little lighter, as I want to see what the salt does in both scenarios. I actually aimed for the dyeing to be quite messy, as salt is a great softener of colours, as well as creating a pattern which will become more and more obvious in later experiments. I was a little concerned that the dyes would react too quickly using a pre-soaked fabric, but I thought that it was worth seeing the results nonetheless. So once the dyes were down, I immediately picked up my salt and began adding it to the fabric. I began by sprinkling rock salt over the areas that are the darkest, allowing tiny gaps between each piece of rock salt. Now the experts do this by placing each salt crystal down by hand using tweezers, but I'm not a professional dyer, and so I was quite happy just to sprinkle these on in handfuls, as I just really wanted to get an idea of what the effects will be. I don't have a particular pattern or shape in mind, but just really wanted to create a sample of the possibilities. But in hindsight, I should probably have been a little less random. However, I just wanted to get an idea of what the salt could do, so I think it was probably a good start. I know that the table salt will suck up more dye than the rock salt does, and it should result in a very subtle texture in a far lighter tone than that which was laid down. But let's see what happens once the cloth is washed and dried. So by the end of adding the salt, my cloth looked like this. I left my project to cure and dry for around 12 hours, and then all that was left to do was to shake off as much salt as possible into the sink, remove the fabric from the frame, rinse, then wash the fabric in a mild detergent, rinse it some more, and then just leave it to dry. Once I'd run a quick iron over the cloth, I ended up with this. So let's examine what I did and the results. It appears that the table salt affects the cloth by removing dye from the fabric without leaving much of a texture. This top corner should be as dark as the area at the bottom, but it is dramatically lighter, and all the variations of the tones that were quite strong have been removed, leaving a soft and very subtle blend of colours. This strikes me as a great technique to use if I want very subtle texture, and I can already see it being useful for creating clouds. And it also strikes me that if I think a dye that I've just put down is too dark or intense, I can actually use the salt to lighten it and erase it slightly. So now let's look at what the rock salt did, and this for me is far more exciting. The rock salt, being larger crystals, makes a sort of mottled effect, which I can already see being used when painting water. This is a technique that I now want to add to my techniques list, and so I thought that I would explore it just a little more. Being emboldened a little too much by my first experiment, I decided to create a seashore. I wanted to see if the salt could be used as a successful dye barrier, and whether I could use salt dyeing to create a watery texture. I didn't really have a plan in mind for this one. I just went with the flow, as sometimes I think it is just good to allow my creativity to take over, as often the results can really be quite rewarding. And it helps me to gain confidence in my creative judgment. And as with all art, it is a great way to just get lost in my imagination and totally forget the world outside my studio. So now it's time for experiment 2. This time I ran my cloth under a cold tap and then wrung it out before pinning it to my frame. You see, fabrics expand when wet, so by doing this I can get an even tighter stretch on my fabric and hopefully create a more intense technique this time. But let's see. This fabric was not pre-soaked in soda ash. Instead, I just used my usual dyes that had been mixed with chemical water. So I mixed a sandy colour first. This was made by mixing up the pre-mixed Procyon dyes golden yellow, and I added a little turquoise to it to make it just a little browner. I'm using up some old dyes for this experiment, but if you only have the primaries, mix up an orange by adding a tiny bit of magenta to your lemon yellow, and then add a tiny bit of turquoise to that to turn it a little brown. Just as a quick tip, if I need a specific colour, I buy these in small envelopes and then transfer them into old spice jars, and as long as the lid is firmly shut, they seem to last quite well. This dye was bought probably 4 or 5 years ago and is still as dry and as powdery as it was when I first bought it. In another pot, I made a turquoise and then split this into 2 separate pots and added a little black to one of the pots to create a darker blue. Now, before I lay down any colour, I want to create a barrier on my cloth, and I'm going to infer the seashore with the sea lapping a seashore of golden sand. I'm going to create a curvy line across the fabric, and this will define the sand from the water, and I'm hoping that the salt will stop the 2 colours from mixing. To define the shape of the line, I first added some rock salt. This is easier to move around if I change the shape slightly. But there is no dye on the cloth right now, so I can spend some time getting the shape right, but not too long that the salt starts to suck up all the water. What I'm hoping here to achieve is a salt barrier between the 2 opposing colours. Once I was happy with the curve, I then just added some more rock salt crystals to any uneven areas, and then I picked up my sandy coloured dye and applied it to my cloth with a thick brush going up to the salt line but not into it. As I applied my colour, I can see that the sandy dyes are spreading too far into the salt line, so I decided to reinforce this salt barrier with a good dose of table salt as its centre. From my initial findings, it appears that the salt will provide a wonderfully soft, organic result, which is always going to be a lot lighter than the dyes that I've applied, as the fine crystals will suck up the liquid, pulling it away from the surface. But by adding a strong line of table salt at the centre of my line of rock salt, I am hoping that this will create a strong barrier to prevent the two sides from meeting and to create a kind of resist. After that, I began to add the turquoise to the cloth, staying away from the salt line at the moment. I then built up the colour with my dark turquoise, applying it in a way that reflects the shape of the salt line and adding a little tonal variation too. And I added more of the dark dye to the top to refer that the water was deeper there. Then I picked up my turquoise again and dabbed this into the areas nearest to the salt curve, and I let the dye spread naturally up to the line. I decided to add more table salt, but this time only a small amount in the blue area, again to replicate the curve, and I'm hoping that this will just lift some of the dyes from around the salt barrier and add a very subtle texture. Then I added more rock salt to the fabric to create the salt effect that I wanted. I added less salt to the sand, and in the blue I replicated the curve shape in places with a more concentrated amount of rock salt. I wanted to create a soft feel in the blues and a slightly more defined texture in the sand. Then all that was left to do was wait. I took some shots of this experiment as the fabric began to dry, and it shows exactly what the salt was doing. As the cloth dried, the salt absorbed the liquid and drew it into the crystals. The blue seemed to be working a little better than the sand, but we'll see what happens at the end when I rinse off the salt and dry the fabric. I left this to cure for 24 hours before I took it to my sink and rinsed off the salt. You need to make sure that you remove all the salt, as if this is left on the fabric, it will eat away at the fibres, and over time the natural fibres may actually disintegrate. After that, I simply removed my fabric from the frame, rinsed the cloth in cold water, making sure to allow for all the salt to be washed away, and then I left it to dry in a warm place. So, this was what the cloth looked like after the first try, and to be honest, I really at that point wanted to throw it away and start again. But I persevered and spent quite a bit of time adding more and more dyes and salt, and I waxed in some areas to see what that would do too. But to be honest, at the end, the whole thing really was a bit of a disaster, with the sand being, well, probably one of the ugliest things that I've seen recently. However, the time was not wasted, as I was able to learn a lot about how the salt behaved, and at the end of the experiment I also realised that using a dye mixed with chemical water was not the way to go. So sometimes this happens, and I spend weeks on a batik only to realise at the end that it really wasn't that great, and over the years I've learned not to get frustrated or despondent. Instead, I go through all the things that the batik had taught me, all the joy batik painting had brought me, and remember that batik painting is never really a failure, but it does just depend on how you look at it. Anyway, onwards and upwards. For my next experiment, I decided to use no soda ash at all. Well, not until the end. The idea here is that by allowing the dyes to move around the fabric without actually reacting with it, when I spray on a strong mix of soda ash and water at the end, whatever effect that there is on the fabric at that moment will be the effect that remains on my cloth once it's washed. Well, that was what I was hoping was going to happen. Anyway, let's see how I got on. I began by applying tap water to the fabric, and then I added some rock crystals in the centre, just to define the line that I want to make. Then I sprinkled a thick line of table salt over the rock salt markers. I then placed rock salt on the outer edge of the table salt line, creating a sort of soft gradient outwards from both sides. I then mixed up quite a strong turquoise by adding quite a lot of dye to a small amount of plain water, and I made sure that it was thoroughly mixed. I applied this onto my cloth with a large brush and stayed well away from the salt line. I replicated what I was doing on the other side of the salt line, and then I added a strong black to the top and bottom of my fabric. I left this to dry naturally for around 8 hours, so it was still a little damp at that point, but I thought that it was time to brush away the salt and apply my soda ash solution. When I had removed as much of the salt as I could, I popped the cloth back onto my work surface and I filled a small spray bottle with a strong soda ash solution. and then I liberally applied this onto the cloth, but not so the cloth was sitting in puddles, but just enough to make sure that all the fibres were fully soaked. And then, again, it was just a case of waiting. And this time I left the fibres to cure for around 24 hours, and when I returned, my fabric looked like this. So then it was time to wash the fabric and have a look at the results. I washed my cloth a number of times in cold water, continuing until the water in the bowl was clean. I then washed it in a mild detergent, rinsed it some more, and then I dried and ironed my fabric. And here it is. Now, I think this has worked a little better than the last experiment, but the results still aren't exactly what I was hoping for. After the cloth was washed, all the intense detail of the salt effect appears to soften or disappear completely. The turquoise in parts looks really good, but I had a nagging feeling that I should have taken the advice of the experts and pre-soaked my cloth, as although the first experiment was a little unfocused, the results did seem a little better than anything else that I've tried. So once I realised this, got over my frustration, took a deep breath and actually had a lie down, I decided to do one final experiment. I replicated the process I used to create the previous experiment, but this time I pre-soaked my fabric in soda ash. I used the same dyes as the last time and added the turquoise either side of the salt line, and then I painted on the black dye at the top and the bottom as I did before. I added rock salt to my fabric and put slightly more salt nearer to the line I'd already put down in table salt. Now, I was running out of rock salt by this point, so there was slightly less salt crystals added to make the gradient, but apart from that, I think this is a comparable process to that was used in my last experiment. I left this for 24 hours to do its thing, and after that I brushed off as much of the salt as possible and left the fabric to set for another few hours. Then, as I did it the last time, I rinsed away all the salt and washed the fabric in a mild detergent. Rinsed it again thoroughly and then left it to dry. Once dry, I ironed my fabric and here it is. It appears that the colours have faded a little more than in my previous experiment when I sprayed on the soda ash at the end. However, the salt effect, I think, is a lot nicer. I still can't capture that more impactful effect that can be achieved on silk, but the effect here has its merits and was definitely worth the effort. Even though at times it was frustrating, my studio was in perpetual chaos for weeks and I went through quite a bit of dye and salt in the process. I guess that my takeaway here is if you want to create a texture on cotton, hemp, bamboo or linen, this is one of the ways that you can do it, and I would definitely pre-soak my fabric in a soda ash solution to get the best results. If I decide to do more experiments with salt dyeing, I think I would probably put slightly less liquid onto my fabric, as I know that that will affect the results quite a lot. And I think my first experiment was a lot drier than the rest, hence the reason why the results were surprisingly better than some of the later experiments. I guess that my takeaway is if you want to create a texture on cotton, hemp, bamboo or linen, this is one of the ways that you could do it. And I would definitely pre-soak my fabric in a soda ash solution to get the best results. Now, I'd love to explore this process a little more, but I've run out of time. Because if I don't get this video out to you soon, you're going to think I've stopped making them. Anyway, if somebody wants to try salt dyeing at home on cotton fabrics and they get better results than I did, please let me know in the comments and tell me what you did, because I want to build a community so we can share knowledge. Anyway, I'm going to hang up my lab coat for now, and I'm returning to contemporary batik painting for a while. But I have begun to research thickened dyes, so if you're interested in those, make sure that you sub up because that'll be coming later on this year. In the next video, I'm going to create a batik, explain my creative and technical process, and begin to explain more about colour and how I managed to get complementary colours next to each other without creating muddy colours in between. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if batik painting and fibre art are your thing, and I'll see you in my next video. But until then, remember, whatever you do today, just make it creative.